So first up is Bret Kugelmass, a former technology entrepreneur who's dedicated his focus to climate and energy challenges. He was one of the early pioneers in commercializing drones. He founded, ran, and sold a business within complex technical, regulatory, and public opinion frameworks. He has a master's degree in robotics from Stanford in 2011, and his earlier work includes designing a lunar rover controller for NASA, concept electric car for Panasonic, and automating solar manufacturing processes for Nano Solar.
So we're all clean energy and engineering professionals here, so I've got a pop quiz for the audience. What would be the result if globally we got to zero new emissions in every sector? Electricity, transportation, agriculture, industry, heat, everything. Would the climate get better, worse, or stay the same? Zero new emissions, okay? So raise your hand if it would stay the same. Raise your hand if you think things would get worse. Raise your hand if you think things would get better. Interesting. 3 completely different outcomes for the same scenario in a room full of professionals in this space, about split 30% each. That's crazy. Although it's commonly assumed going to net zero does not leave us at the same temperature that we're at today. It leaves us at the same rate of adding heat that we're at today, a radiative forcing of about 3 watts per square meter. In mechanical terms, for this audience, greenhouse gases act as a valve, not a sponge. I'm going to use an analogy to make this point crystal clear. If you're driving towards a cliff at 30 miles per hour, zero new emissions is not stopping the car. It's continuing at 30 miles per hour. Another year worth of new emissions is the equivalent to driving at 30.4 miles per hour, and then 30.8 miles per hour, and then 31.2 miles per hour. It is slightly worse, but as a society, when we're about to make decisions to the tunes of tens of trillions of dollars, we should probably discuss that whether you get to zero new emissions or do nothing at all, you end up in the exact same place at almost the exact same time. Virtually all discussion in the media, the papers from policy wonks, everything you hear from environmental groups, politicians, clean energy startups, what you talk about with your friends and colleagues, it is all to solve the wrong problem. Getting to zero new emissions will have virtually no effect. So if this is the wrong problem, what is the right problem? Well, to avoid any further warming, we need to get the atmosphere back to a state of radiative balance. That's a bit less than 300 parts per million CO2, what it was about 1750, 1800. We need to remove roughly 1 trillion tons of carbon and counting. And that's just to stay at the same temperature that we're at today. Now, if there's one thing that I can guarantee, removing that much carbon is going to take a lot of energy. And all that energy is going to release more carbon as well. So just how much is very critical here. Here's the governing rule for any approach to solving climate change. Your entire capture system must permanently store more carbon than is emitted in its production and that of the energy source it utilizes. When I left my life as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur to start a nonprofit, the Energy Impact Center, it was based on this premise: to discover the subset of solutions that could actually make a difference, that could actually go negative, that could actually stop climate change. You see, if you're not going negative, even if your favorite solution replaces a worse energy source, you're actually not making things better. You're still adding carbon to the air, which further increases the rate of heat addition. It's like punching a small hole in a sinking ship instead of punching a big hole and then claiming you're helping the situation. Low carbon energy is not fixing the problem. Only extremely low carbon energy can. Before I get into which solutions can go negative, and I promise that's coming, we're going to discuss one more problem that the climate change discussion has fundamentally wrong as well: the real role that energy plays for most of the world. Although we don't perceive energy very much throughout the day directly, it is far more than gasoline and leaving the lights on longer. Energy is embedded in food, in medicine, in buildings. Energy moves goods and people around the globe. Energy is in everything that you need, and energy is the core at what you love about a prosperous world. Restricting energy, on the other hand, with higher costs, means real hardship is spread throughout every part of life. The poorer you are, the worse it hurts. This is why we decide to subsidize all types of energy, including dirty ones, as the benefits from inexpensive power have a truly profound positive impact on quality of life. For most of the world, especially the poorest, less access to energy could actually hurt them more than climate change will. And they would feel it immediately, every day, in everything they do. Let's observe a very similar decision regarding energy access that humanity has already made. We knowingly continue to pollute the air with particulate, causing millions of cancers and asthmas every year just to receive slightly cheaper energy. We've had the medical reasons and the technology to replace coal for over half a century. But the only thing that ever meaningfully has is another cheaper form of power. Do we really expect a worldwide consensus on sacrifice now, across all age, class, and creed, to combat a threat distant in time and place? What the climate elite ignore is that to anyone but the absolute wealthiest, electing for more expensive energy isn't even a consideration. Okay, I promised a solution, right? So let's derive one from first principles. If your mathematical imperative is that we must account for previous emissions, and our societal bounding condition is that we must do so in a way that doesn't impose an economic burden, then we must take the very things that require energy and result in the release of carbon dioxide and force them, by definition, to capture and sequester carbon dioxide. In other words, we need to make fuel and products with hydrocarbons, just as we do today, but with hydrogen and carbon from the air instead of from the ground. In this scenario, nothing downstream, not behavior or infrastructure, needs to change. And energy consumption all of a sudden has the exact opposite effect on climate. If you use carbon from the air, the more people consume, the more prosperity we enable, the faster we will solve climate change. If you want to actually solve this problem, and do so in a matter of years, not just decades, you need to make carbon-negative fuels cheaper than carbon-positive fuels. This is a complete alignment of individual behavior, market forces, environmental health, and human well-being. But to do so requires extreme energy abundance and an extremely low carbon footprint. It's a high bar to meet. And when I started the Energy Impact Center 2 years ago, we ran this calculation for every known technology, and we found only one source that even came close to meeting these requirements. Not only is uranium an order of magnitude more abundant, but it has 6 orders of magnitude the energy density of fossil fuels. 3 million times as much energy. And to solve climate change, all nuclear power has to do is produce heat just 3 times as cheap. In the last 2 years, my organization has interviewed over 1,500 experts across technology, industry, economics, policy, and more to figure out why this hasn't happened yet. And what it would take to make this a reality. In that time, I've personally done over 100 site visits to research centers, power plants, universities, and conferences in over a dozen countries and asked over 10,000 questions along the way. We document this process on the Titans of Nuclear podcast, and if you're not already one of the 50,000 people who follow us, I welcome you to join. I will now give you a summary of what I've learned over the last 2 years and wrap up with a plan to get out of this mess. I don't know if you remember what you heard about nuclear growing up, but I certainly thought that a nuclear accident was the definition of catastrophe. That Chernobyl poisoned millions of people, that Fukushima killed thousands, that nuclear waste could find its way into our water. But even given those reservations, I started down this road because, for God's sakes, I'm a Mechie. The math was the math, and only nuclear could save us from climate change. We would just have to engineer those problems away. So I started asking questions to figure out what had already been tried and what were the most promising paths forward. And what I found was totally counterintuitive. Not only were none of those assumed hazards even possible, but it was the nuclear industry itself who were the ones convincing the world of disproportionate risk. You see, it's a very engineering mindset to believe that if someone feels a technology isn't safe, that by making it safer, you'll assuage their concerns. But any social psychologist will tell you that constantly insisting that something is safe to someone you don't know makes people feel less protected, not more. The nuclear industry has sent itself into a spiral towards obsolescence, where they'll spend any amount of money to make a plant ever more safe. And that is the very thing that convinces people it is not. By separating nuclear plants from major cities, by burying them in concrete, by securing them with mini armies, by inspecting them constantly with an independent authority, we convince the public that what is inside must be so dangerous that it warrants such disproportionate measures. Even the nuclear startups are guilty of this, as they promise the next generation of reactors to be safer instead of cheaper. They're throwing the entire industry, including themselves, under the bus as they reinforce the assumption of an underlying hazard. Let me make this crystal clear to those who aren't in the industry. Despite 3 gigawatt-scale meltdowns at Fukushima, where every single safety system was rendered inoperable, not a single person was hurt. What more do you need to know to totally rethink every assumption that you've ever had about nuclear energy? Now, don't get me wrong. This is a brilliant, brave, and well-intentioned community. Masters of physics, chemistry, engineering, operations. But the culture has evolved to the point where they believe protecting people from a hypothetical threat of radiation is the same as protecting people. And because of this, each and every nuclear reactor throughout its lifetime will spend $10 billion on extra equipment, personnel, and paperwork to prevent an accident that wouldn't hurt anyone, even if it happened. The ultimate effect of trying to convince the public that nuclear won't kill people is that we've made it more expensive than coal. And in doing so, over the last 30 years, we have allowed 150 million people to die from air pollution. If we are to take our mandate of public safety seriously, then we need to factor in all downstream consequences, not just radiation. This will allow nuclear energy to become ever cheaper and ever faster to deploy. It will lead the world into an era of virtually infinite abundance, clean air, clean water, and a stable climate for every person on planet Earth. Let's summarize. In order to stop climate change, we need to remove 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in a way that doesn't require sacrifice. To do this, we need to make carbon-negative fuels and products that are cheaper than carbon-positive fuels and products. To do this, we need to make nuclear 10 times cheaper than it is today. And to do this, we need to convince the entire nuclear community they have too narrow a view on public safety. That radiation isn't the threat they need to protect against. It's non-consumption. Then, we need to build the equivalent of 40,000 1960s light water reactors without all the additional requirements that they've added over the last 6 decades. These will capture 1,000 gigatons of CO2 and create roughly $500 trillion in carbon-negative fuels and products along the way. That may seem like a really high number, but it's not. The energy industry is already $6 trillion a year, so over 20 years, it would just be quadrupling their market size, which we should be eager to do to bring the entire world out of poverty. Which is why I'll wrap up with a plea to the fossil industry. Exxon, Shell, BP, get in the nuclear game. Start by convincing countries to let you quickly and cost-effectively swap out a coal boiler for a 1960s light water nuclear reactor. You know better than anyone how to construct large buildings with pipes in them. You still get to sell liquid fuels at the end of the day. You still get to use your existing infrastructure. Same political and customer relationships. Virtually nothing has to change except what you build next. Take this olive branch and become heroes of the planet. Pump fuels from the air instead of from the ground. And to anyone who wants to join the Energy Impact Center and dedicate their career towards enabling this vision, we're growing fast and we'd love your help. We have one mission and one mission only: clean air, clean water, and abundant energy for all humankind. Thank you.
So, do you have any quick questions?
My question is this: nowhere in your discussion do you ultimately talk about waste. I've been to a nuclear power plant. I've looked at the swimming pool with the spent fuel rods. They're still there. I remember when Yucca Mountain salt domes were the place to put them. That's lacking from your discussion. Could you please clarify?
Are you under the impression that nuclear waste has ever hurt a single person, place, or thing in all of human history?
I'm not under that assumption, but I'm under the assumption that it will continue to conglomerate in the swimming pools. Where do you put it after that?
Same question could be asked of anything. What do we do with our tennis shoes? What do we do with our clothes that have toxic chemicals in them? Most elements last infinity long, including heavy metals that can poison people forever. Nuclear, the thing that we're so scared of, that lasts for millions of years, that's because it transmutes into other elements. So we painted this picture where nuclear is a threat for millions of years because it lasts for millions of years. That is simply not true. To further expound upon that, after Chernobyl, the only isotope that hurt anyone in any situation was iodine-131. Not iodine-129, not iodine-135, not cesium, not strontium. So we have an example of where what's inside a nuclear reactor can get out into the environment and hurt people. And guess what? All iodine-131 is gone within a single month. So yeah, we've all been led to believe that nuclear waste is a threat to humans, mostly by the nuclear cleanup industry. Hanford derives $2 billion a year, $400 billion total. Same is going to be said at Sellafield, $200 billion is going to be spent. Same is going to be at Fukushima, another $200 billion. It's the radiation protection industry that has convinced you of that. It is simply not true.
Hi, also not an industry, but I wanted to know if the idea of a thorium reactor is being taken seriously and if there's a timeline that could be given for the development of a functional thorium reactor.
Your question presumes that thorium is a better technology than what already exists. And that's probably based.
Its byproducts are non-toxic, which would eliminate his concern.
That couldn't be further from the truth. To process thorium requires an entire chemical plant using ungodly amounts of toxic chemicals along the way, and the intermediary byproduct of what is used in a thorium plant is pure uranium-233, which is the equivalent of plutonium-239 in terms of proliferation concerns. So although I know that thorium has gotten an incredible amount of hype on YouTube over the last 20 years, it is worse than almost every other nuclear technology by any metric I can come up with.
How can we get that aspect changed? Because to really make nuclear as a solution, we have to change the fundamental thinking of the people.
I don't think that there's anything that educational organizations can do to influence public opinion en masse. What solar has done, what wind has done, what even the fossil industry does, I mean, they have hundreds of organizations spending billions of dollars on marketing with like brilliant marketing people full-time. This is all they do. They get articles written in the newspapers, they create hype, they create a sense of momentum, they create the narrative, they fund think tanks. I mean, this is a very, very, very expensive proposition to convince the public of anything. And the problem with the nuclear industry and why it's been off the table for the last 50 years is because the nuclear industry died 50 years ago. In 1978, money shored up because projects were running over budget, interest rates were high, and all orders stopped. That's before 3 Mile Island, by the way. The entire industry died. That's when we lost our ability to market ourselves to the public. And so we've had 50 years of neglect from corporate marketing, which is what you really, really need to do to convince 300 million people of anything. So until we get big corporate players involved, hiring those brilliant marketing people in the world, working full-time, nonstop, lobbying politicians, pouring billions of dollars into it, nuclear is going to continue to remain as this kind of like weird other technology.
It appears that the current nuclear fleet in the U.S. is not able to compete on its own economics in the market environment, and the next generation is out a number of years, whatever that may be. Do you have any thoughts on how, outside of out-of-market subsidies, let's say, to the legacy nuclear fleet, the existing nuclear fleet can be made more competitive in today's market situation?
So I'll take the first shot at that. First of all, let me just state, in continuing with my previous statements, our electricity generation market today is in no form, shape, or design a free market. It is highly regulated, highly manipulated, and very well incentivized by many of the same lobbyists and conglomerates that Bret was referring to. So I think we have it's a wide spectrum of how you value things across that energy spectrum. Some of our plants across the United States are very competitive and economic because they're in different markets, right? We have plants that are under stress, economic stress, in regions of the country that makes no sense. I don't understand how we're closing down electricity generation plants in the Northeast when we have such a shortage at times of natural gas. So I think we have to write or correct how we value and incentivize our energy resources.
So I agree with John. If we look at different parts of the country, the situation is very different. Some of the plants in the Midwest are flexing because they're avoiding negative prices. In regulated markets, that's not the case. But I'll go to those projects that we announced on the production of other products. Yes, hydrogen's the current focus in various markets where that could go. Water as well. Those utilities are thinking differently about how they use their assets. When we first started talking about this a number of years ago, there weren't a lot of believers in that. Nuclear produces electricity, and that's the way it is. That's what we've been designed to do. And so we did some research working with advanced reactors, and ultimately the industry came to us. Utilities that own and operate nuclear plants came to the labs and said, we see what you're doing for advanced reactor analyses. What can you do for us? Will this help our economic footing moving forward to produce other products, maintain our baseload thermal power operation, producing electricity when needed, and then looking at those other commodities? Initially, it was thought, no, we should only couple electrically, but now they're looking at thermal integration as well, and that can be done safely and efficiently with current fleet plants, as well as designing from the ground up. And so everybody is beginning to think about these things differently, and I expect within the next few years we'll see some of those plants demonstrating production of hydrogen and showing that they can be viable with this different market perspective.
Both those are very valid. I'm glad you brought up two different things, because there's actually a third way that you can do this too. Nuclear fuel, the operating budget for nuclear fuel is $5 a megawatt hour. That is the cheapest source of energy than you could possibly imagine, period, hands down, end of story. A nuclear power plant runs for 2 years straight in continuous operation, and yet it has 800 people there filling out paperwork, doing safety checks. If all you did was remove the regulatory burden that required there be 800 people working at a power plant, where the equivalent coal plant has something between 20 and 30 people, nuclear would not need any subsidies. It would not need anything. It would instantaneously, through market forces, become the only source of power on planet Earth.